All right, hello and welcome. And we're just going to get started on our flower chart. This is considered a advanced beginner kit only because some of these stitches would be learned in like a level 1 stitch sampler kit. And then this is where we're going to apply them. So some of the techniques you're using are something that you, if you've never learned before, may be slightly difficult if it's their first time stitching. But for a beginner, these would be just more advanced because you're actually applying them. So if you are a first time stitcher, that does not mean this is not going to be suitable for you. So don't be alarmed by that concept. We're going to teach you everything you need to know as a beginner. So the first thing we're going to do, if you have the kit, you're going to have a pre-printed fabric, your needle, your pre-cut thread, and you're going to have your instructions. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our fabric and we're going to get it into our hoop because that's our first step. If you have bought the PDF, you're going to need to do the transferring portion of this pattern. So you need to transfer your design to your fabric. So you might want to jump over, do that, and then come back to us. It'll be in your digital file. So our first step, because ours is already transferred, which is one of the benefits of this kit, is to actually get our fabric into our hoop and just centering it along there. And I like to, so we're going to take our inner hoop, which is the closed portion of this hoop, and our outer hoop, we're going to loosen our screw a little bit so that it slides over top of this really nicely. I'm just going to make sure that I have my fabric exactly where I want it. Takes a little bit of finicking sometimes because we can kind of fiddle with it once it's in there, but it's easier to get it roughly in the spot we want it. That'll do. You can always change it after too. All right, so as I close this, I'm going to tighten it a little bit, and then I'm going to pull my fabric around the edges and just kind of get it tight in there and the fabric laying like flat. You'll notice that you'll get some bubbles, and then I'll tighten it a little bit more. It'll probably create some more bubbles, and I'll keep pulling as I get that fabric in there. I like to pull more from the sides on this kit just because of the lettering. If you're pulling from the bottoms, it can kind of warp your text a little bit, but obviously we need to pull everywhere. And then I'm getting that top screw really tight. I'm not tightening it completely before I pull just because you want to pull, tighten, and just keep going around until you kind of get it really nice and tight. You want to hear sort of that drum sound. You want it to really sound like you're playing the drums. That's the key to keeping the tension, and it'll be a big part of your success as a beginner stitcher. One of the biggest mistakes people make is that their fabric isn't tight in here, and then they end up with all this slack, which makes it difficult to stitch. So this is a pre-printed fabric. So the fabric is quite a heavy cotton twill, and I really like this one for the pre-printed for this specific pattern. I use two different kinds. I use 100% cotton and then this cotton twill. And for this one, because it is such a like intricate design, I liked the heavier fabric. It gives it a little bit more weight. And then the idea for this one was that I liked the idea of potentially being able to hang this in a frame with this fabric, and the heavier weight would be a little bit nicer for that. So that was my intention, to give you guys that option. So now that we've got it in the hoop, got it nice and tight, one recommendation that I'll say is to have a little screwdriver handy. You can give it, I've tightened that as much as I possibly can with my fingers, but if I give it a few turns, I can actually turn it quite a bit with a screwdriver that I couldn't with my hand. So a screwdriver is always helpful. And then we should be ready to stitch. So you've got your supplies. Your needle comes in this prepackaged little kit. Depending on the kit type you have, you may have the beginner box, which comes with this. So you might have a lot more options for needles. We are just going to use the size 24 tapestry needle. It will work for all of the stitches. If you have the big needle pack and you've done one of our strands kits, you can choose to use a different needle or something else, but that is the one that will come with the essentials kit. And then all of your thread in the essentials kit will be pre-cut for you. Again, if you got a bigger, more deluxe box, you're going to have all the full skeins. If you do have a full skein of the thread, you know that you're going to be pulling from the numbered end of your skein, always pulling from that end. And we're always pulling about an arm's length of thread unless we're working with 12 strands. So in part of your kit with your pre-cut thread, you're going to find that for 2 of your roses, you're going to have an extra long piece of floss in both this red shade, your light pink, and as well your hot pink. So basically all of your pinks and reds, you're going to have an extra long piece of thread. That's the thread that you're going to be working with the woven wheels. So just as we get to those parts, make sure that you're using the longer strand for the woven wheels. It's made so that you can double it up, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So your thread is pre-cut for you. You will need to split your strands yourself. So when we get started, I will start with splitting strands and explain a little bit of that. The few concepts that you need to learn as a beginner before getting started is going to be splitting your strands, threading your needle, knots, and different stuff like that. So this is going to be your beginner section. We're going to start with taking the thread. Obviously, we just talked about coming from your skein. So I'm going to start with the first shade I'm going to be using for this kit, which is 26 in the light purple. And I'm going to pull at arm's length of thread. Again, like I mentioned, if you are doing this kit and you have the pre-cut floss, you will already have these cut to an arm's length. So when we get our floss, it comes with 6 strands. So these 6 strands are twisted up. And if we pull the end of our thread, it kind of divides, it separates the strands into kind of like pulls them apart a little bit more naturally. And as we can see, like these 3 are slightly more separated from the other 3. So actually pulling them in a more natural way makes it easier to twist them. If I start to see the bottom twisting like that, I will pull it straightened out, and then I just continue along the bottom, straightening that out as I go. And I sometimes just guide my finger along it, just helps to separate it. And then I take my 2 sections and put one aside, and I'll thread one set. So we're going to get our needle out. One of the biggest mistakes that beginners do make is that they take too much thread. So this being pre-cut to an arm's length, that's a good amount of thread to work with. If you are finding that it's knotting up quite a bit on you, you can do something called doubling up your floss, or if you're just finding that you're losing the thread on your needle more often than you'd like. So typically when we thread a needle, we'll leave like a little tail hanging here. I typically pinch my needle as I stitch to prevent it from pulling out of the eye of the needle. And then we would just knot the end of our thread. But if you are a beginner and you're finding that you're losing the thread on your needle, you're having to rethread your needle quite a bit, one option is to take your 2 ends and actually tie them together. And what this does though, is this is what we'll be using for the 12 strands. This creates the doubled up effect. So what essentially will happen here with 3 strands is you'll now be stitching with 6 strands. Now, for most of these stitches, you're going to be using 3 strands to stitch it. If you need to stitch doubled up, I would suggest going to 4 strands for anything that it says 6 strands on. I wouldn't suggest, anything that it says 3 strands on. So I wouldn't suggest going to 6 strands. I would suggest threading 2 strands and then folding that over and going to 3. I also wouldn't suggest going down to 2 because stitching with 2 strands takes quite a bit longer. So for this pattern, if you feel like you need to double up your thread, I would recommend stitching with 4 by doubling up 2. Otherwise, we'll just stitch with our tail hanging down here. And a suggestion is just to pinch the needle as you're stitching. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to tie a little knot in the end of our thread. You can either do a quilter's knot, which is, I'll show that after, First, the most simple is just to do a loop, push your thread through the loop and pull a knot. Just a simple knot. I just slide it down as close to the end as I can get it, trim the end, and we're done and ready to stitch. If you would like to do a quilter's knot, which is just a different version of creating a knot, you have take your threaded needle, and you're gonna put it horizontal to your thread, and then take your thread over top. I like to put my finger on top of the thread, on top of my needle, so they're kind of like coming at each other from the other angle. Sorry, just get the focus for you. And then I wrap it around my needle, maybe 3 times. I keep my tail over here so that it's not, so it's on the other side of where my working thread is. And then push up and pull your knot through, which creates a knot, trim your end, and you're ready to go. So either of these works. Again, if you're doing the doubled up, which we will always do with 12 strands, you're gonna thread 6 strands and then fold it over, which doubles it up. You'll just put your ends together and do the flip. And I don't think you could do a quilter's knot. I mean, I guess maybe you could. Never done a quilter's knot with 12 strands. So, okay, so then we've got our needle threaded. And then the last thing I'll show you is how you would finish a stitch. So here's one of my practice ones. I'm just gonna quickly show you as if I had stitched through here. I'm gonna do a little stitch over top. Okay, and then, so I am ready to tie off my thread. I'm gonna come to the back of my pattern where my thread is at the back, and I'm actually just going to push my needle underneath some of my already finished work. I'm gonna guide it underneath and loop it around my already finished stitches. An extra protection would be if you wanna thread your needle through the loop, which creates kind of like a knot. I would say you really only need to do that 2 times. So weave it underneath the other stitches 2 times before you're done, and then trim it up. There's not a lot of pressure on these projects, so you don't have to knot it too many times. You're not putting a lot of strain on it. So just create my knot one more time. Okay, and then we have learned to split our strands. Obviously threading our needle, I didn't go over too in depth, so we can talk a little bit about that if you still need some guidance. These needles are designed with quite a wide eye, so they shouldn't be too difficult to thread. Some small tips would be making sure that you're working with a nice blunt end, so just giving it a trim before you thread it. I always wet my thread, give it a little pinch so that it's nice and flat. I pinch it between my 2 fingers, and then I take my needle with my large eye up to my thread while it's pinched, and I kind of guide it in through, and then it threads so easily. 3 strands is a really easy one to thread with these wide tapestry needles. The tapestry needle, which is what's included in the basic kit, it should come in any box that you're getting, even if you've gotten the deluxe box. The reason that I stitch with these, I always stitch with these when I'm using 12 strands, 6 strands, just because threading 6 strands through an eye of an embroidery needle is quite difficult, whereas threading it through a tapestry needle isn't the easiest, but it's not, it's normally like a 1 try situation. They have quite a wider eye, so they are so much simpler to thread. And when we're working with a pattern that varies in the amount of stitches, the amount of strands that we're using, I find the tapestry needle is a quite middle of the road. It's got a really wide eye, so it works great for 12 strands, but it also is thick, but not too thick. When you go to a size 1 embroidery needle, which might have a wide enough eye to thread 6 strands, it's going to be a very thick needle. Whereas a tapestry needle is about the width of a size 5 embroidery needle, which is a really great needle for anywhere from 3 to 6 strands. It's kind of that middle of the road needle. So that's how I feel about the size 24 tapestry needle. It's the same diameter as a size 5 embroidery needle, which is considered one of the most universal. So it just has a larger eye. It is a little bit shorter, so I find some people like a longer needle, which embroidery needles are, but it also has a dull tip, which I really like because it's sharp enough to stitch through the fabrics that we use, but not so sharp that when I'm trying to grab my needle at the back and I poke myself, it doesn't hurt. Okay, so that's a little bit about needles, which is just the basics. If you want to learn more about needles, I do have a kit called the Strands and Needles Stitch Sampler Kit, which goes into lots of in-depth information about strands and needles. but we won't talk too much about that here. The next thing is that you're going to be ready to stitch. So once you're ready to stitch, I will meet you back. We're going to start with our lilac, and we're going to start with 3 strands of the DMC 26, or you can go to DMC 31. We're just going to be starting on these little flowers, and I'll give you a few examples. And I will see you back there, ready to stitch. All right, so the first stitch we're going to work on is the lilac up here, and we're just going to work our way around the pattern. And if you'd like to work in a certain spot, you can just switch from whichever flower you want to do first. So the lilac here, we're going to be using 3 strands. I'm going to start with the DMC 26. I don't know why, this is just how I stitched it. You could start on this side too. The flowers are all identical. So the key here is that we want to make sure that we are, especially if you've had this pattern done with a non-erasable pen. So in this case, we have this pre-printed fabric, and we don't want these black lines to show. So let's make sure that all of our stitches come up on the outside of the black line. Just something to be cautious of, because you will see that if you're not coming up on the outside of it. And we're doing a satin stitch. So we're just going to come down straight through the center of this petal. We're using 3 strands. So the second stitch that you're going to do after you do your middle stitch is you're going to come up on the outside of one side of that middle stitch. It's not imperative which side you use, but then I'm going to stitch just behind. So I'm going to put my needle kind of just a little bit from the center, just behind that stitch. I'm just kind of not putting them all down into the center. This is a pretty small flower, so you won't need a lot of stitches, but I kind of stagger my stitches so that my first stitch goes all the way to the center. My second stitch comes just a little shy of all the way down to the middle, and then my next stitch will overlap. And the reason that we do that is because these flowers in the center here are not designed to hold as many stitches as you need on the outside to cover. So we have to shorten some of our stitches. Around the side here, you'll see that my next one, I'm just going to tuck it behind. Just making sure I'm coming up in the right spot. So for this stitch, I'm going to really tuck it in behind instead of trying to make it all the way down to the bottom. I just want to tuck it in behind and cover the side there, and then coming up just a little bit behind. Oh, see that little piece of fluff? That is the tail from my knot. So just pulling that back down. That'll happens to me all the time. And then right back down to the center to cover all the way. And one thing that I do like to do is I like to give my little flowers like this a tiny little fluff. The little fluff gives it a little bit of shape, like a dimension to it. It gives it kind of like a 3D effect, which I really like the texture that it creates. You could also do this stitch with more strands, which would do the same thing, but I find it's easier to do it with 3 since it's so tiny, and you can still create the bulk. So this one, which is my second stitch, I'm just going to tuck in behind. Or sorry, actually, I already did a second stitch on this side. So I framed my middle stitch and then coming down. So you just kind of have to eyeball it as to which, whether you're going to do a long or short stitch. So does it look like it's getting too full at the base of the petal? Yes, I'm going to make a short stitch. No, I've got room. I can make a longer stitch. So I'm going to tuck this one just kind of behind, not like too short because I do have a little bit of space, but just enough. And see how that strand kind of came down and it's a little twisted? Did it with the other one too. I like to pull my thread out and just run my needle underneath of the strands until I get them to lay flat. Just creates like a smoother stitch than the twisted stitch. So then I'm running my needle underneath of my stitches, which gives it a nice little fluff and a nice little shape. And then I'm ready to move on to my next petal. So making sure I'm coming up on the outside of that stitch, coming down into my center. And then following all the way around. You can do one side of the petal and then go back and do the other side. I have a habit of doing each side of my straight stitch. I don't know, it's like a little cork. This is just how I do it. I'm coming down just behind. I think I only need about 4 stitches for this one. And then I shift back to my other side and normally finish one side and then come back. So I'm going to tuck this one in behind a little. Okay. Give it a fluff. I don't know if I only need maybe 5 stitches on this one, so I'm just going to see where it takes me once I've finished one on this side, whether I even need to do more. Okay, I think I will be able to stop there. And sometimes like I've stopped and been like, that's enough stitches on that petal. And then I've come back at the end and I've added a few more. Just once all is said and done, you know, I take a look at it and I say, I think that petal looks a little sparse. And I mean, like when the whole pattern is done, you can always go back and do that. So again, it's just a couple of short stitches. You can make some of them, on some of our other satin stitches, you're gonna have to do a lot more of the short and long. These ones are actually quite even from top to bottom as far as thickness, so you don't have to do as much short stitches. Because this one overlaps, and because, sorry, this specific petal overlaps the lower flower, I am not worrying as much about my line on the inside of that, just because it'll be covered. So for this pattern, I'm going to go through every stitch once, maybe twice. Like I won't do all of our little flowers here. I'm just going to do one for you, just because I think it'll get pretty redundant to follow all of those tutorials, and you may feel like you have to watch all of them because I might say something you didn't know, and I would hate for you to feel like you have to watch them just to make sure you didn't miss any information. But it'll be pretty redundant. If I think that there's anything you need to see, like that's different about any of them, I will show it all, but just so that you know why I'm not showing every single one is because it's going to get pretty repetitive, and that's a lot of video for you to watch. It's also a lot of my voice. Got quite the twist there. So I'm just gonna come in. It's kind of got like a little, and I'm gonna do that same thing where at the back I'm pulling on the thread while I'm kind of fiddling with it at the front to get it to lay nice and flat. And that's just a technique that I use to even out my strands. I hate when you're doing a satin stitch and one strand is twisted. It happens all the time, but that's a good trick to use. And then fluffing, continuing to fluff it up. It helps me see how many more stitches I need, so I fluff as I go. Because sometimes you'll fluff and you actually won't need another stitch. Oh, I actually ended up going through a strand there, as you can see. Not sure if as I go back down, if it'll even itself out. And you'll be able to see that I split through that strand. It did kind of mess with that one a little bit. I may have to pull that out. I may be able to just, oops. I may be able to just pull on it the way I fluff them up and get them all to lay even, but okay. Kind of messed with that one strand. Okay, that will be something I might need to fix. So I'm just going to show you how this overlapping, these two petals which overlap, just quickly in case you are feeling a little bit stressed about those overlapping ones. And then we'll move on to our French knot. I'm going to give it a little bit of fluff before I'm about to stitch my overlapping parts. I can fit one strand still in there. And then, oops. So I'm going to come up in there, and then I'm just going to stitch kind of in behind so that it fills in the gap, but it doesn't actually like fully overlap that one. And then they're nicely butted up against each other, but you can still see which sort of petal is which. You'll be able to really define each petal by doing that fluffing up of the sections, and it'll keep them from kind of blending all together. Also, they're going in different directions, so that should help to define which petal is which without them melting together. Tuck this one in behind. This was a little bit of a bigger petal, so it had a bit more space to fill at the top. So I did want to make sure that I tucked at least one or two of my stitches really behind the others so that, and this last one on the edge I'll tuck kind of behind, right along the line of the curve, I think. And then right here, I want to get in and just cover that line, but without covering the other petal too much. So I'm just going to go right along that. There we go. So then I'm fluffing this guy up. And I'm fluffing this guy up. And they just kind of butt up against each other. We'll take a look at I'll show you on our example. You know, almost like they just melt into each other, which is sort of how a regular, but you can still see the defined petal. To be honest, that one almost starts to look like it's part of this petal, but that's okay because when you see a flower in real life, that is sort of what, you know, they kind of are meant to do. So we will tie off our purple thread at the back the way we learned in our beginner section, and then I'm going to move on and grab a little bit of the yellow just to do the demonstration. I did talk about this in the written instructions. So for this pattern, I'm going to demo how you're going to do these French knots in here, but I will recommend that you wait until we get to this Cosmo to do the French knots on this one, and this one, because if we wait, we won't have to actually, like, you're using the same color in all three places. So you're not putting that color aside and then trying to find this little scrap of thread. Like leave it all together and intact, and then we'll split the strands, do these 3 sections, and then you're done with that color. So you don't accidentally lose a shade, or like, that's always what happens to me is I actually lose the thread. So this way you can keep all of it together, and then, but I am going to demo how to do that French knot so that it's all in one place. So. All right, so we are creating a single French knot in our little lilac flowers. So for this, we're using 2 strands, and we're gonna wrap our needle twice. Depending on how many strands you use and how many wraps you use, you're gonna get like a really cool effect, and you can change it depending on, so I'm gonna show you quickly. So if we have, say, for example, 3 strands with 1 wrap, it's actually pretty similar in size to 2 strands with 2 wraps, maybe more like 3. But so in this case, I want to use 2 strands because I want to be able to wrap it twice. I think to wrap the needle twice is easier to make the knot than it is to do a 1 wrap. I find 1 wrap knots more difficult than 2 wrap or 3 wrap knots. So in this case, I want to use less strands with more wraps to create a bigger knot with the wraps instead of a bigger knot with the strands. Hopefully that makes sense. Because yeah, they are a very similar size, the 3 strands, so for this one, in this part of the pattern, we're only using 2 strands. That's because we're gonna wrap twice. If we were using 3 strands, I wouldn't wanna wrap more than once, but I think it's easier to do a 2 wrap French knot. So in this, you're gonna come up through the center of your little space, and you're going to wrap your needle twice. And you can wrap like from either direction, it doesn't matter. I'm going to wrap from the back over 1, that's 1 full wrap, 2. So I've wrapped twice around my needle, and then I'm going to press my needle back through the fabric pretty close to where the other hole was. It doesn't really matter. You can go through the same hole or you can just go next to it. You don't have to be that worried about it, just in the same space. And then this little working thread, which I'm holding, which I wrapped my needle with, I'm going to need to slide that knot by pulling that working thread down into my flower. You want to slide that knot before you push the needle all the way through, because that's what keeps the tension on your knot so your knot doesn't unravel. Then I can push the needle down a little further, grab my needle from the back, and pull the thread through, which will pull my knot down into the middle of my flower. So I'm going to show you guys that one more time on this one, even though I don't have all the petals done, that's okay. This, obviously you will have finished all of your purple, all of your dark purple in 31 so that you're ready to make your knots. But for obviously demo purposes, I don't want to do too much. Okay, so 1 wrap, 2 wraps, and then we're pushing our needle back into that center space, pulling with our non-dominant hand the working thread, and then pushing our needle back down, grabbing it from the back. You can kind of let go of this thread if you feel like you need to, but I like to kind of keep it a little bit, the tension on it, and then pull down. And you should be able to create a successful knot by making sure that your knot is at the base of your fabric before pushing the needle all the way through. I do have on my my YouTube channel some troubleshooting for French knots, which basically just goes through this a few more times. If you want to watch that video, if you're still struggling, I will have it linked in your digital file. So that is French knots. We'll talk about them again when we get to our daisy and our cosmos and our next flower. So you'll see them many times if you want to watch a little bit more. But I do suggest holding off on those until you get to the end of the cosmos so that you can do them all at the same time. We will see you back. We're going to finish off our stems, and then we'll move on to our next flower. So the next step is stems. It's 937 in 3 strands. Okay, so I did recommend in your digital file that you can save these stems until you're ready to do the stems and on your other flowers. The only one that you won't wait to do is this one here, because you need these knots before you do your woven wheel. But that one's a little different. You can hold off on these. It's just, I recommend that just so that you don't have to like keep these little strands of thread laying around. But of course that's like completely up to you if you're able to keep it all organized however you'd like. You can finish each flower. I wanted to keep them in the tutorial all together so that you can, but I will go over it. Okay, so for this one, we are doing you can do a split stitch. You could just do a straight stitch if you like, but I'm gonna show you the split stitch. So you're gonna go down one stitch and then coming up another stitch length ahead, you're going to just cut through your last stitch, splitting the strands in half and stitching through it. And then the same thing, repeating that process, you're gonna come all the way up to where another stitch length ahead, and then coming back and stitching through your last stitch. And then to finish, I like to come up and just split my last stitch in half so that all the stitches, so you're kind of coming up at the exact end point where your last stitch ended, but it still is to split that last stitch in half. And then, like I was saying, you could just do a straight stitch. Like you could have done both of these in just a straight stitch if you want to make it simple for yourself, but I did do a split stitch for both of these. Either one will look great. So we're just, again, splitting the strands and then coming up right here, splitting that one in half, and then coming up just like literally not even a stitch length ahead, just the hole right in front of it, and splitting our last one. It just keeps it looking like the splits even instead of having this one last long stitch. So that finishes off the stems for that one. And then we're going to move on to our next flower. At the end of this, when we do get to the tulip, I will obviously be going over the split stitch again, so you don't have to worry about trying to find this tutorial in here. If you're ready to do your greenery, you won't have to worry about that. So don't stress about being able to find this spot again, because you'll learn the split stitch again. Okay, so we'll move on to our next flower and I will see you back. All right, so we are gonna work on our Ranunculus flower. Hopefully I say that right. The first thing that we have to do on this flower is do our French knots. These are done with 6 strands, but I did do the doubled up method, which means that I've got 3 strands threaded through my needle and then doubled up. I folded and then tied a knot at the bottom. It just makes it easier to pass the needle through the thread, pass the needle through the fabric, and it also makes it easier to get it back down after you've wrapped the knot. So we're gonna wrap 2 times, 1, 2, and then I'm gonna put my needle down beside, kind of this, like, so I have these little guides on there, which are gonna be helpful, but they're not like, you don't have to follow them exact. It might not be in the exact same, your knot might be bigger or smaller, and you might have to put more or less than these little dots that I've made. So wrapping 2 times, 1, 2, push our needle down through the fabric, guide our knot to the surface of the fabric, and then pull our needle the rest of the way through. So you don't necessarily, when you're doing these wraps 1, 2, have to worry too much about how tight this tension is. I can keep this quite loose, push my needle down while they're still quite loose, and then tighten it now at the end. As long as you keep the wraps wrapped. Sometimes they'll unwrap if you're not paying enough attention. So we're just creating, I start by doing the wrap around, like the layer around the outside of the circle. And then we'll fill in the center. So wrap, wrap. And then creating my knot, coming all the way down. I'm gonna slide one more in there, and then I'm gonna move actually on to the spokes and the rest of our flower. You can finish the rest of your knots and then meet me back when you're ready to do your spokes. So if you haven't already, we're taking our DMC 350, and I mentioned earlier that you're gonna wanna take the longest of that thread. So in your package, you're gonna have some pre-cut thread. One of them is gonna be double the length of the other ones. That's the one we're gonna be working with here. So we're just gonna, pinch and just have to wet that again. We're gonna pinch and thread, and then I'm folding this over because it is obviously double the length. I'm taking my two ends, having them meet together, and then I just throw a little knot in the bottom like that. I am going to trim that little end quite short, just so that there's not a ton of thread floating around. And then I'm going to take my needle, get it to that halfway point, just smooth it out, make sure that it's all even. And then I'm going to create my spokes. Sometimes I do recommend creating your spokes with just 6 strands. In this case, I've included enough thread that you can do it with the 12 and then you don't have to change. But again, if you want to do 6, that's fine too. It is a little bit harder to get your needle through the fabric when you've got 12 strands. When we do a woven wheel, we only do it like one time other than the spokes. So if you're having trouble, you could just do 6 strands and then change it to 12 after. Okay, so we're coming straight to the end of that and just creating a straight line. And I will meet you back here when we're done our spokes. Okay, so we've created our spokes, and I'm just gonna come up between 2 spokes. And then you're just gonna go in an over-under pattern. So right now I'm gonna start with going under my first spoke. And it really doesn't matter which direction you go. I think depending on whether you're right or left-handed, make one more comfortable than the other. And you're just going under this one, then you'll go over the next, then under, and you're just switching back and forth between the over-under. And for this, the reason that we do our French knots first is because they create a really nice guide all the way around, so that our thread can come and kind of bump up around it. And I like to make it nice and tight so there's no gaps. The other thing I'll say about doing the French knots first is that if you don't, trying to do French knots through the opening will be difficult, and you'll also likely snag some of your woven wheel, which is one of the things we always like to avoid. So we're just gonna go around the pattern all the way over and over. I like to pull the first couple weaves around the wheel, especially like the first and maybe second, quite tight. And then from there, I typically just guide it around so that it's sitting beside, and I don't pull it tight. I just pull it until the tension is out of the strand. You're really gonna wanna make sure that you're not jolting or like yanking, because this isn't stitching up and down, and you're not anchoring each stitch. If I pulled really hard on my thread right now, I would change the tension of the entire wheel portion. So that is one thing to keep in mind when you're doing this, is that you can kind of screw up the whole thing. You also could nick one of these, and if you pull it out, it changes the shape of all of them, or it just, so you really want to be going slow, steady, and cautiously. So I like to just be cognizant of where this loop is, because sometimes it'll get hooked on the top of your thing and you'll be pulling and it'll abruptly stop, which you're not expecting. And all of those things can affect the tension. So I've created the amount of thread that you're given for this so that essentially when you run out of this longer thread, you'll be about where you should be for switching the colors. It's designed so that it takes a bit of the guesswork out. It's about, you're supposed to stop about 3/4 of the way. So if you, for some reason, say you did your like you may have done your spokes in 6 strands, you might have more thread. So just stop when you get to about 3/4 of the wheel. So, and some of them will be different. Like this one seems to be almost finished. That's okay. But right now I'm pretty much at the end. I want to make sure that I have enough to stitch down and still knot. So how I normally do my stitch down to end the section is I do it as if I'm still continuing on. So I want to cover this spoke from here to here. And then this one I'm going to be going under. So I'm just going to stitch right beside it. And then it almost emulates that I'm stitching down. Or sorry, scooping under that spoke. So I'm just going to tie off, and then I'm going to get my next. You have a longer strand of your 225. Take that one, put it on your needle, and we'll be ready to finish our wheel. Okay, so then when we're coming back up, I normally come up on the other side of that spoke as if I've dipped underneath of it. And you've done the same with your thread. You've doubled up your 6 strands on your longer strand that's included in your kit. If you have the kit, the deluxe kit that comes with the full skeins, you're going to do 2 arms lengths to equal what we've used here. So just in case I didn't already say that, it'll be 2 arms lengths. And then we're just going around following our same pattern. And I'm going to quickly skip to the part where you know when you're done, and I'll see you back there kind of when you're around the outside just to explain how you know you're finished. Okay, so as I'm coming to the end, I'm coming around and I'm starting to get to a point where I've covered most of my spokes. Sorry, I just had some strands separate. So I typically like to go around my wheel even after I start to see that I've covered the spokes. That would be like a good indication of being done. This one obviously has like a small dotted line around the outside, which is also a good guide to kind of be like, okay, you've covered that. You're about done. The more you go around your wheel, what starts to happen is because it's not, you don't have any more out to go because your spokes are there, what will start to happen is your pattern will actually start to, or your flower will actually start to go up, because once you've gone out as far as you can, it's just going to start tucking around and it'll give you more depth going up, which is one of my favorite parts. I love that. So I often will go around quite a few times. You've got enough thread to go around a bunch, but you will probably still have some extra of your pink. I could probably still go around like maybe even 2 times if I wanted to finish it, but I think I'm pretty close to done. You can fluff it up around just to make sure that your little line is covered. And then to stitch down, I do something similar. I went under that one and then I would go over and then I would go back under this one. So the one that I'm going to go under, I just stitch down so that it creates that same, can't tell if I'm going under the spoke or if I'm finished stitching. So it's hard to tell where your stitching starts and ends. And then I've covered everything that needs to be covered and my ranunculus is all finished. So then you can take your needle and you can kind of fluff things up. It just depends on what look you like. Some people like a little bit of a messier look. I like mine pretty uniformed, but sometimes I'll give it like kind of like these little fluffs along the edges, but you have to be very careful when you're doing this because you can totally ruin your woven wheel. So yeah, that is the tutorial for that one. So you're ready to move on to your next flower and I'll see you back over there. All right, so I have DMC 3865 on my needle in 3 strands, and I'm gonna start this flower here. So the one thing that I'll say, this is the satin stitch, but we're using it in a flower version, so I call it the satin stitch flower. Other terminology that people have used is like a radial satin stitch, which basically just means it's like a oddly shaped satin stitch. So I'll preface this by saying the bottom of this petal is much narrower than the exterior of this petal. I'm going to show this huge one because it's going to give you the best explanation of how we're going to do this. you're going to have a lot more stitches coming from the top than you will at the bottom. So what we do have to do is we have to layer them in so that you don't end up with this big, what I call a traffic jam, or a big like hump where you've put too many stitches at the bottom and they can't all fit. So another thing that I'll note is that you're going to end up covering these tiny little like dashes that come out, and that's okay. They're there as a visual guide, but the reality is you won't be able to see them when we actually get to stitching them. So you do have this pattern in your digital guide, and you can reference it. You can kind of look at it to see what they look like, just to give you an idea. And they don't have to be in the exact spot that they're drawn on this sampler. It's just not possible. You can't stitch over something and then see it after. So we can just reference it as a visual guide in our pattern. Okay, so then first thing we'll do is we'll stitch straight down the center, just like we did with our little ones. And we're going from top to bottom, creating a nice long straight stitch. That's actually not that much in the middle as it could be, but that's okay. So again, we're making sure that we're stitching from the outside of that line. It just helps cover the black line instead of having the black line showing. So I'm going to actually do, for this huge one, I'm going to do 2 straight stitches that both extend all the way. And I've kind of now cut my flower in half, and then we'll work on one side at a time. So I'm coming up. It's hard to find my place right now. I want to be very specific about where I come up. Oh. Okay. So we're going to come up and we're going to actually do a shorter stitch. I'm going to go about maybe halfway, and see how I'm kind of tucking it in behind these other stitches. That's one of the tricks too, is to make sure that it's like not this blunt stop. It's all kind of covered by your other stitches, helps so that you don't see that blunt stop. But what will also cover it is this next stitch, which is going to be slightly longer. But again, kind of tucked in so that it's not totally visible that it's shorter. But because it's longer than the last one, it will cover where that other one ended. And then this one, I'm going to go all the way down and do a long stitch. So I've just filled in 3 stitches with only one of them to the bottom here. So it's kind of the ratio that you have to figure out. How many short stitches to long stitches do I need? Like, do I have 3 times as many stitches here as I do at the bottom? Probably about that. So for every long stitch that I do, I kind of need 2 shorter stitches. That's just like a guesstimate. It doesn't have to be perfect, and you can fiddle with that. And it doesn't have to be like exact. You can do 1 short stitch and then do a longer one right after it if you think it's going to look better aesthetically in some places. And towards the outside, we may do that a little bit more around the curve. That'll be fine. So we're just doing short, and then a little longer, and then the longest. And the idea behind that is that the longer ones cover the shorter ones. So you want to start shortest, then do like tiered, layered, tiered. So as you can see, I'm running out of space down here. I've probably only got really 3 stitches left to fit in there. And I probably have even more that need to go at the top, like then. So I'm gonna do an even more graduated. I'm gonna do 2. And add 1 more that doesn't even go down to the bottom. Sorry, I'm trying to get it tucked in nice and close right in the correct spot. Which when you're stitching for a tutorial, it can be kind of hard to get your eyes close enough. For this flower, you can tell sometimes I have my face directly up against. So I'm going to do this one quite short. Because again, I'm trying to fit in quite a few stitches around this curve. And a little longer. And then for this one, I'm going to kind of stop right where the edge of it meeting up with this one goes, because this one I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to kind of do the petal like that. Actually, that's not true. I'm going to do one more stitch in here. You're trying to define each petal on its own. So this one extra stitch I think will help define where this petal ends and that petal starts. So this one, when I'm coming in, I'm going to be stitching a little edge right there. And what I might do right now is I might show you, so this half, you're going to do the exact same thing. You're just going to do exactly what I did over here. I'm going to show you this half of this petal, which is up against it, just so you can see how you define each petal without making them kind of, they do blend together like a little bit, like you can see on, I'll show you quickly on the example one, like they do blend together, but you are meant to be able to define which petal is which, so a little bit. So we're going to do the same method, doing one long and then one short. Got a knot. So when we get a knot, to kind of pull back and undo it. I'm just going to make sure that my fabric is tight in there. If it starts to slack like that, you want to pull around the edges just to tighten it back up, because the slack does not help the finished look when you're stitching. So even though I'm trying to get to this edge, I always still start from the center of my petal. I don't finish one petal and then pick up right here. You can actually see right here where you can see where that one stitch ends and it doesn't cover it. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to throw a stitch right in between and I'm going to make it come just right down over that. It's just, I didn't quite tuck them in enough, which then made it a little obvious that those ones were shorter. So you can fudge that too if you have to, because the last thing we want is to have it not looking seamless. And that's where tucking it in behind is like your best friend, because you really, as long as you're tucking it in behind a longer stitch, it makes it harder to see that, it makes that shorter stitch less visible. Especially as we come to the edges where they're meeting up with another section, you're wanting to get as many stitches in, and they can't all make it down to the center. So I'm going to do one longer one now, and then the rest now around this corner, I'm going to tuck in behind my longer stitch, because I don't want them to overlap my other petal, which is how I'm going to keep them from defining one petal to the other. So I'm just tucking them in behind. And then if it looks like they're too separated right now, don't worry, I will, once I fluff it up a little more. Okay. So you can see that once I kind of go like this with my thread, you can still see each petal defined, but they're not overlapping each other. So it's it creates like the perfect line, but without it being like too blended together. It's just kind of like that middle road. So you see these lines, but you also see this line here. And that's what happens is around this curve, tucking them in behind the straight stitch right there. So I'll finish off with the thread that I have on my needle. But that should give you a good idea or a good knowledge base for going around, and you just apply those principles to the rest of the pattern. And don't be afraid to throw an extra stitch over top if something just doesn't look quite right. It might seem odd to do that, but it actually is totally like, I mean, you could pull it out. Don't get me wrong. It's your call. If you want to pull out the thread and just redo it, you can. But like in this case, here's an example. I made one stitch like significantly shorter than the other. Even over here, like some of them, I could throw an extra stitch in. And I'm going to do that because I want, with a white thread like that, the black line is a little harder to cover. And you really want to cover that black line. So if you want to go in, just fill in the gaps where the black line is still showing. You can go in and just very carefully throw in some shorter stitches to fill in the line at the top. And in this case, I went like too low on one stitch, so I'm going to do the same thing, except I ran out of thread. I'm just going to add in a little stitch, and then you just can take your needle and kind of fluff it up and even it out, and you shouldn't see it. But those are obviously like, you wouldn't want to do that with a whole flower. You want to keep it as unison as possible, but when you need to do that, that's going to be the quick fix, the simple fixes to help instead of maybe having to pull out a whole flower. Okay, I'll meet you back and we're going to start working on the center, and then you're going to finish obviously all of these, and then we'll meet back when we're ready to finish the center. So for this petal, we've come down around the side and really created like a nice curve there. And then we're wanting to do this petal, which is going to look kind of like it sits in the background instead of the foreground. So because some petals you want to sit more forward and the others sit a little bit behind, I'm going to just show you quickly how I would do this one. So I'm doing the same method of just doing one straight stitch through the center and then curving that one in behind. And then I would do quite a bit of in behind because I don't want my stitches to cover this curve here. So I'm going to tuck in behind here. And then for my long stitch, because this is such a short and small stitch, I'm coming as far down as I can to layer in without trying to cover the edge of this petal here. You kind of just have to eyeball it. And then for this little curve right here, I'm going to do the same thing I did on the other side with the little curves, and I'm mostly just going to tuck them in behind my section of longer stitches. I'm just kind of, I'm trying not to cover that, but just coming in beside it. So once you kind of get to a point where you can see that you've covered it, but you're also like, if I put one more stitch in there, I'm going to basically cover it. I'm going to pop back and I'm going to finish the other side. If when I get all the way done everything, I feel like I could have added a few more, you can always pop back and add more. It's a lot harder to take them out when you feel like you have too many. So one tip is to do the ones that maybe look a little bit like they're pushed more forward. So I might have left this one till the end or this one till the end. You can either work all the way around or you can do the background looking petals last. Just missed a stitch, I think, there. Oh. One of my threads came undone. Okay, so for this section, we're just working with 2 strands and we're going to do a satin stitch through our center. So we're just splitting the middle right down the center. And so there's 2 things. You could, obviously you probably have all of your petals done. So you're going to be going from one side to the other. You just want to make sure that you're covering the entire center. So coming up like not into the white part, but just right at the point. So almost like sharing a hole, I would almost say. Like you want to come up almost through the same hole or the one right next to it that the white is coming out of, just so that it has like a seamless. And then here you can see that like I've almost got a hole between, like I have a gap between. I'm going to go back and fill those in. You're just doing a satin stitch all the way across. We'll do half of this. I'm going to start on this side actually. They don't have to all be like side by side either. You can break them into little sections and then fill in the gaps like I've been doing. Or you can do them, I can't even get my needle to come up anywhere near where I want it to. Or you can come up like one after the other. But a straight stitch is just or a satin stitch is just a straight line straight through the center of the space. Fill in my edges. You're just following the lines. Okay, so we're gonna do our little pistils, and we can see, like, you can look at your digital file to see the like kind of depth, like how deep, but you're just gonna go do some little straight stitches into it. This is probably gonna be my longest one. So I'm just gonna do one straight stitch in, and then I'm gonna do some shorter ones. And I am not looking at the guide of what this actually looks like underneath, so I'm just doing random long and short little stitches into my petal. And you just fill it evenly. We're using 2 strands. And you'll just do straight stitches all the way around, making sure that they're kind of random. You don't want like 3 long stitches in the same spot all the same length. You want to kind of vary the lengths. And then I'm going to put 1 into this little petal. Okay, and then the actual French knot that you're putting at the end of this, how I recommend doing this is you're going to come up on one side of the stitch that you want. So you want it to be on the end of your little blue line. You're going to come up on one side of that line, wrap 2 times, and then come down on the other side of that line, on the other side of that stitch. So you're coming up on one side of the blue stitch and down on the other. That will anchor the knot so that hopefully the knot stays on the surface of your flower. And then you're going to pull it down. And I suggest not pulling the knot too tight, just because if you pull it super tight, it might go like all the way into your flower. And we don't really want it to like disappear into your stitches. We want it to stay on the surface. So that's why I said you might not want to pull it as tight. But, and you can do this with, you can stitch on one side of the blue line or just any strand in general, like on the surface of the flower. You can just do it onto the white strands if you can't get on your blue stitch. It's just to anchor it so that it doesn't slide between. So if you want to go over top of a strand, so that the strand holds it on the surface of the fabric. Because if I go down through the same like part, and when I say part, I mean like literally where the threads have parted, then my knot's going to end up like way down here underneath my stitches. But if I anchor it with one strand, that strand will hold it from sliding between the stitches. And if you're finding your knots are feeling too big, like you've done them and your knots seem bigger than mine and they're not getting as tiny, you can just do 1 wrap. If you don't want them to be 2 wraps, if they're just, and then you can, and if that makes it feel simpler because this is such a small space, and that is more just about the way everybody has a little bit of a stitching style. My knots when I do 2 wraps might end up smaller than your knots when you do 2 wraps. So don't stress if I'm doing two wraps and you do 2 wraps, it doesn't look right and you want to make them smaller, just switch to 1 wrap. Okay, so you'll do that all the way around for each of your lines. If you have any troubles with your French knots, you can revert back to the troubleshooting video that I posted in your digital file for troubleshooting French knots. But hopefully now that you've got a little bit of experience, you feel ready to do those ones. Okay, so we're going to move on to our rose, which is very similar to our ranunculus, just with a closed woven wheel. So I will see you back there. You can start putting 12 strands of your thread on your needle. So we are now ready to move on to our rose, which is done using a woven wheel. We did our open woven wheel for our ranunculus flower, but this is a closed woven wheel, so it's very similar. You're gonna use the doubled up 12 strands like we did up here, and you're gonna do the same thing, creating your 5 spokes. And once you've done the 5 spokes, I will see you back here. All right, so we've created our 5 spokes, and we're gonna do the same thing. We're just coming up in between 2 spokes as close to the center as possible, and then just starting our over under pattern. Again, it doesn't matter if you start with an over or if you start with an under, and it also doesn't matter which direction you go around your woven wheel. So we're just following around it. Like I said on the other wheel, we're gonna pull our first few rows quite tight to the center. I like to give it like quite a solid base. I just don't want you to be able to see anything underneath. That's why I pull it nice and tight, and it just secures it. And then we're gonna keep going around, and I start to just relax a little bit on the tension, not necessarily keeping it loose, but just not pulling it as tight. Some of the common questions I get are the twisting. So as you can see, the thread sometimes twists as you go. I just untwist it as I go. If something doesn't sit right, I pull it out, and then I kind of pull it back into my woven wheel. If it's kind of, you know, too twisted up, or I don't like the way it's sitting. Oops, and I try not to get my needle through the spokes. You want to go under it, which sometimes happens. You nick the spokes. And the same tips as before, just trying to make sure that you're not getting your thread caught on anything, because that does create, what happens is it'll jolt, and then your whole thing will come can just create some tension issues. And I basically pull until I can feel it. The tension is gone, and then I stop. And you want to keep the same tension throughout the whole thing. So if you're doing a looser tension, that's a choice. If you're pulling tighter, you can do that, but just keeping the same thing throughout the whole woven wheel, because that'll make a difference in the I'm trying to think of the right word, the unison, the unity, I don't know, the uniform look that you're going for, I guess, or anyways, you want it to all kind of look similar throughout. So you're just going to keep going around and around. Like I said, I just pull back if something doesn't sit quite how I want it to. And then I will meet you back towards the end of your rows to close it up. So I ran out of thread before I actually finished my full wheel. So this was my extra long piece of thread. And in your kit, there will be one extra long piece of thread, and then there'll just be regular lengths. You'll have enough for an extra, just like I have here, one just regular length one to double up, and then enough for your flower over here too, but they're separate. So you will have, if you need it, one more regular length piece of arm's length piece of floss to stitch the rest of the way. You may not need it depending on how you did yours, but I need one more regular to just finish it off. So that is included in your kit. You will have enough to do that. So for the stopping and starting, I did the same technique that I used in the other woven wheel, and I'm just going to start back up and follow my way around my wheel again. And for the part where you're getting towards the end, I'm so close to the end, which so you could choose whether to keep going or not, but my spokes aren't quite covered, so I am going to continue. And just going around the wheel until, well, a good guide is until the dotted lines are covered, or you can cover them by fluffing it up. They're pretty faint, so it shouldn't be like, they're not a dark circle around. They're just like the dotted lines to give you a guide as to when to cover. And I just like to go around enough times that it covers that, plus it gives it a little bit of extra dimension, that 3D, because once you start to get to the outside, it starts to give you more lift. And I really like fluffy woven wheels. So if you have any spots where, say, the dotted line is still showing, my recommendation would just to be to put like a stitch down. Right now, the only spot where I'm kind of still seeing a little bit of my dotted line is at the very bottom here from this angle. So to close mine up, I'm just gonna do one stitch down over that area, which is just gonna cover it, and I'm gonna fluff it up, and I'm all finished and ready to move on to my daisy. Okay, so we're doing for our daisy the same stitch we did up here for our satin stitch. It's just a little bit of a different shape. So it'll just be more of a refresher and more of just going over how to do this on a different shape. And we'll just do a quick tutorial to get you off and stitching. So straight down the center, we're using 3 strands of the DMC 3865. And we're staying on the outside of our daisy line. And this one is actually a bit more even as far as the outside to the inside than our other flower petals. The other flower petals on our last one were quite different in size from the top of the petal to the center. So you had to do a lot more of the staggered stitches. So for this one, I'm going to do a short one here. You can probably still do 2 short, 1 long, but you might not have to do as much around the edges of the short and long than you did on this last one. But I like to start with the short and long through the center. Just so I make sure that I have enough. And I think I skipped a stitch in it because I can see my black line there. So is this the technical way to fill a stitch in? Maybe not, but I'm going to just throw a stitch in the center there. I could pull it all out. I could pull out that last stitch and move it closer, but I don't typically like to do things the hard way. So we've got actually 3 short stitches. So I'm going to do my long now. And it just pops in the side. Those are almost in the same hole. So for this flower, we're keeping our top stitches, the stitches at the top of the petal, quite close together. To create that really nice clean edge around the top. That is why I ended up throwing an extra stitch in there. And so I've done 1 short, do 1 more short, a little longer, but still short. And then I'm going to throw in my long, and I'm going to do the rest probably of my stitches long because I still have a decent amount of space at the bottom to throw in my long stitches. And I've probably got 3 stitches left and enough space for 3 at the bottom. Looking at that, I can see that I want to throw 1 more stitch in there. And how I'll do that is I'll literally just run between the stitches that are already there and just stop short. And I've created a little bit of a short stitch in there. Sometimes when you're working with 3 strands and you're working on such a small space, you do notice that it's hard to get your stitches close enough, and sometimes you just realize that you could have included one more stitch in there, and it's okay to toss it in there. Better filled than not. Okay, so a little longer than the last one, just to cover the end. And then all the way down to the center. Looks like I did the same thing on this one too. And part of the reason that you're seeing like that there's a gap there is because there is a black line. So if we didn't have that black line, you might not have noticed, because it's a white fabric, that there's like a gap there. So yes, there is sometimes parts of the pre-printed fabric that can make it a little finickier, but just as long as we're watching for it and we're being careful, we can cover it all. Probably the white fabric, or sorry, the white thread is the one where you'll obviously notice it the most, because it's the biggest contrast. But the little patience and attention to detail, which if you've ever followed me, if you've followed me before, you know that attention to detail actually isn't my strong suit. Okay, so we're almost done this petal. And these petals are all pretty much identical, so you probably don't need to see me stitch any more of them. I've given you all of my tips and tricks, and you can see it's a pretty straightforward staggered satin stitch. So we are finished. I'm just gonna, oops, I snagged that one. Smooth out. Just be careful when you're running your needle along that. It's actually not maybe the best idea sometimes, because you can make it worse than better. Okay, and then so there is your satin stitch in 3 strands, and then we'll obviously go back and we'll fill our center with our French knots, and I'll meet you back once you're done all your petals to do your French knots in the center there. Again, like I've said a few times, we're gonna, if I was doing this pattern without as the example in the tutorial version, I would wait until I was done my Cosmo to go then do all of my little yellow French knots, but I'm gonna show you the tutorial in together with each flower. So we're doing our French knots, and just the same tutorial as we've done before, so this is just a nice refresher. We're coming up from the back of the fabric, wrapping our thread 1-2 times around our needle, pushing our needle back in close or through the same hole, sliding our knot down till it's nice and tight at the base of the fabric, pushing our needle in a little more, grabbing it from the back, and pulling. So hopefully these tutorials for the French knots are making them so simple for you. I know French knots is probably considered one of the more difficult stitches. So I'm hoping that this is giving you everything you need. So 2 wraps, push down, pull, hold the tension, and pull. So if you follow me on social media, or if you don't follow me on social media, this will be news to you. If you follow me on social media, you may already know that I have a 2.5-year-old pug. So right before I started the French knot tutorial, when I was talking, I could hear him in the background getting himself all nice and comfy and situated on the sofa next to me. And one of the reasons that sometimes I don't do video tutorials, or I struggle to do video tutorials, is because he cannot be away from you. If you put him into a kennel while you're in the house, he'll just scream. Like, it's not a bark, it's not a whimper, it's an actual screaming sound. So you'll hear him in the background of my videos clanking around on the hardwood floor, or you'll hear him snorting and making himself comfortable, or you'll hear him snoring or heavy breathing. He is a character. So if you're wondering what some of those sounds in the background are, they are my pug named Pickles. Okay, so hopefully that has given you what you need for the French knot tutorial, and we will see you back on our lavender. We're just gonna finish these. If you haven't already heard me say it, you can hold off on these French knots until you're done your cosmos. And then you can do all your French knots for your cosmos, your daisy, and your lilac at the same time, just to save having to change your needle color a number of times. So we'll see you back in just a second. All right, so we're gonna work on our lavender. So for this one, I actually started at the bottom, and it is just, again, a satin stitch. So I just started from the center, and you work on each petaled section individually. So just one straight stitch down the center. And then just the same concept as every other pretty much satin stitch we've done. It's my tail coming through. So you can tuck it in behind. I like to do a little bit of putting it in behind. For this one, I wanted all of the, you don't need a ton of stitches for each of these little petals, so I didn't need to do too much, but I did kind of tuck it in a little bit, just since I did about probably five stitches per little petal. So I did the second stitch short, and then the last side stitch was a nice long one all the way down again. And the same thing over here. And for this one, I actually did quite a bit of fluffing. I wanted to have like some textures to it. So once I finished each petal, I fluffed it up to give it that shape. And you don't have to keep the tension loose on the stitches to get that. So don't worry about keeping your like stitches looser than you would normally stitch. Stitch normally, stitch till the tension is pulled out, and then that little fluff is just you pulling any extra slack from the back to the front, and then it just creates this nice little rounded shape. If you leave it extra slack, you're gonna make it too loose. So don't worry about doing that, just stitch normally. So I started on the outside petals and just layered them. The nice thing about this one is because your inside ones, you won't see the black line anyways, because they're going to be covered by the other, the interior ones. You don't have to worry as much about the lines except for the outside. So that's kind of a nice treat. It's a little less finicky. It's also a nice dark color, so, oops, got a little knot. So if you get a knot like this, which we haven't had many of yet, you're just gonna pull it out and just kind of wiggle from the bottom until it comes undone. It's not actually a knot, it's just the thread twisted to create what seems like a little knot. So so you should be able to put your needle like through the knot and pull it out, like untangle it. Especially if you haven't pulled too tight. If you pull and make the like knot really tight, it's harder to get it out. So if you feel a knot starting, ease up, and then instead of pulling harder, if that makes sense. Okay, so you can kind of fluff them up as you go. And then just start back at the outside on the next layer, and then I moved my way to the inside again. So and getting your needle like right in there. But yeah, I just worked my way around in rows. So I'll do this one, that one, and then come back in. So where you're coming up to the last one, I'm actually just going to kind of come in, overlap it a little bit, and just butt it up to that last one. Give it that little fluff. This little one in the center, I think I'm short a stitch, so it just looks like it's, and so that stitch will come over, actually go over the other one a little bit, which is good. Just creates that like overlapping look. So coming kind of in between there to just tuck it in. I'll do that maybe for the first 2 stitches. And then these outside ones, I'll just kind of try to come up to where the bottom or the top of the bottom one is. And like I've often said, is less is more. So like I went back in and just added that stitch because I felt like it was still needed. If you overload some of the areas and then you can't get, you can't just take one stitch out. So I like to do, if I think I'm close or I'm like on the, not quite sure if I've done enough stitches, I will stop and then come back if I think it'll look better with a little bit more. Okay, so we've got quite a few of these little petals done. I think you guys get the gist of it. I did try working from the top to the bottom or versus working from the bottom to the top, and I felt like it was easier to layer them properly working from the top to the, or from the bottom up. So you can do it however you'd like, but this is from my trial and error. You get a better layering, and they look a little bit like more overlapping by doing it from the bottom up. Okay, so keeping up with your fluffing, just be careful because obviously you can snag them if you're not. But just a little needle run underneath. So I just wanted to show you guys as I'm butting up to the one below, I'm just kind of coming in right at the top of it, sort of through the same hole, if not just right next to it, just so that there isn't a gap between them, so it kind of looks seamless. Okay, and then yeah, well, sorry, we will move on to our leaves and stems. All right, so we're gonna do our split stitch, which I'm gonna sound like a broken record when I say you can leave all of your greenery until the end and do it all at once, but I'm just gonna do the tutorial here. I know I sound like a broken record. Okay, so split stitch, we're gonna make 1 stitch forward, and then you're gonna come up a stitch length from the back, forward 1 stitch, and then stitch backwards and split your strand in half, pushing through that first stitch. And just repeating that pattern, forward 1 stitch length, coming back and splitting the stitches. So you're splitting it pretty much in half. And we're going going all the way. I'm just going to do this one stem, and then we'll do our little leaf. Just a little itty bitty guy. Okay, and then for the end there on my last one, I came forward, I came up here and then split back. For this one, I came up through the actual thread and split it in half that way. So you can do either or. Okay, and then for our little leaf, I'm gonna come up about, oh, sorry, that's a mistake. I'm gonna come up from the top, from the very tip, and then I'm gonna come down about a half to 3/4 of the way. And then for your little leaf stitches, which is what we're doing here, you could do just a satin stitch, but I always do a leaf stitch because it creates kind of like that vein or bone down the middle. So you're gonna come down about 1 needle's width. So just below the middle stitch, and stitch kind of straight down the center. And then on the other side, you're gonna do the same thing, and you can meet up with that first side stitch. So you're creating kind of like a little diagonal stitch down the center. And this is a really small leaf stitch, so it's going to create like the tiniest one. I'm actually just going to do the next one right down to the stem, so all the way to the bottom. And then again, meeting up with the next one. And then for your side stitches, because you've already hit the center point, I'm just gonna go in right beside it along the stem. And then the same thing here. And then I'll be done. So right in on the edge. And then on this side, we're gonna do the same thing. And this side, it almost looks like based on the shape, I'll only need 1 stitch to cover. So straight down. And we're finished. You've created your teeniest, tiniest little leaf. And so next up, we're going to work on our cosmos, which is, again, the same satin stitch flower technique. All right, so next up is our cosmos. And this one is the same as our satin stitch flower shape that we've done in a few spots. So I'm just going to start in the center the same way we always have. I think I'm going to start right in the dip part, which might not actually be like the full center. And the same thing for this one. We want to stay on the outside of our line, which I know is kind of awkward to do because you're trying to follow the shape. But for this one, I'm going to follow it on the outside of that line. And if I'm consistent, I still keep the same shape. I just make it a tiny bit wider. You can hear the little pug in the background. Okay, so 1 straight stitch down what we're going to call the center, even though I'm not sure that's actually the center of that flower and then we're sidestepping right next to it and coming down and just kind of tucking it in behind. This one is pretty wide at the top, and the base is pretty wide too. So I'm just going to kind of maybe start with a 1 for 1 kind of staggered, especially in this middle section. Okay, and then tucking it in behind. I'm gonna make another short one actually, just because of the angle. And then now I'm kind of at the top, which puts it back on the kind of angle that I want it to be on to go nice straight down to the center. One of the things that I like to do is I like to hold my needle, or I like to hold my stitch. This is a great trick for if you're trying to figure out what something will look like once it's stitched down. If I know I want to go to the base, if I hold my strand like this, I can actually see exactly what it's going to look like once I filled that in. and see that I really only have like one more stitch down to the base before it's getting pretty full. So I'm going to do my little tuck. Maybe I'll do 2 of those. And then do a nice long straight stitch all the way down, right in beside my last one. And since we are going to be doing like our accent stitches, you want to be pretty, you want to keep a bit more, you want to, sorry, I'm trying to spit this out without it making no sense, and I'm not making any sense. You're going to have these little pink strands coming out of here too. So you're going to have even more stitches coming from this space. So don't overdo it with how many long stitches you have. Sometimes we have a little bit more leeway. Since we're going to be creating even more bulk when we add those, be more liberal with how many short stitches you do, because you're going to have an extra buffer too if there's gaps from where where you're covering it with the accent stitches. You're already going to be adding more bulk to that center space, and you're going to, you know, if there is a spot where you're like, oh no, you can tell that stitch is shorter, you will have those pink strands to come in, so you could just cover that space with some of the pink after. Kind of on a weird angle right now where I'm going to do another straight stitch. I'm like coming from kind of over the other stitches, which is okay. It's just the shape of this petal more than anything. I'm going to do a nice short one. And then I'm going to be back on the right kind of shape of my lines. I think what people don't realize is how much, once you get all the stitches in there, kind of blends together. So they're worried that when they're doing the short stitches, you're going to be able to see it. But it really does start to mesh together, and you won't be able to tell which strand comes from which spot pretty quick once it's done. By now you should have a pretty good understanding of how to do these kind of staggered satin stitches, because you've done it on quite a few different shapes now, from little tiny ones all the way to big, like very asymmetrical shapes. So we are just going to do one petal. Nice thing about this one is each petal is very individual, so you don't have to worry about the edges where they blend together. And the next step is going to be our accent stitches, or straight stitches, or blending stitches, whatever we want to call. Accent stitches is what I call them. So I'm going to grab my pink 3354 in 2 strands, and I'll meet you back here to get that started. So for this, because you're only using 2 strands, I would suggest taking like a scrap from whatever you have left over from this rose, or taking a very small portion. Like I would take about this much off of one of your strands, like one of your sections of thread, which you'll have from this dahlia that we're still going to do. Because if you take the whole 6 like long piece and you split it into 2s, you're only going to need maybe one of those 2s, and then you've got 4 strands left over that aren't as functional. So my recommendation is to take like a smaller piece off, maybe 10, not even 10 inches, maybe like 6 inches, and we'll just stitch with a shorter piece. Because you'll be able to split that into 3 to do this whole flower. And to be honest, you will not need a ton to do this. So you'll be able to use a smaller piece of thread. You'll just have to change your thread more, but you're going to get more out of your thread by doing that. So our little stitches, I cannot tell you exactly where to put these because it is not an exact science. So we're going to start how I do it with 3 longer stitches. It's always how I start. So those are probably going to be my longest ones, and they go not quite halfway into my petal. I'm going to do 3 of them. Then in between those 3, I'm going to put short ones. So you're kind of just varying the length and blending it to create sort of like the shading at the bottom of your petal. There isn't an exact science. I don't really see that longer one, so I'm going to throw one more long one in. And you just keep building on top of what you've already done. I want to go a little higher even. So I'm going to do one really long one in there. These shades are not drastic in a color difference. So you're not going to see a massive change until you've got like a decent amount of stitches in there. You won't even see some of it. So I just normally keep filling in with little stitches of 2 strands until I feel like you can really tell that the bottom is pink and that it blends into the kind of orangey color. So you're just throwing in those little stitches and you are all done. There is no magical formula for where to put them. You'd probably say like this half and then as short as like here. So filling in this sort of section. And you can see that on here. They go to about here and they stop about there. So I would say probably like anywhere between as little as 5, as many as 7, 9 stitches, just depending on what look you want. I want mine to have you really be able to see that pink because I really liked the way it turned out when I added quite a bit of pink. It's just got like a really pretty kind of ombre look. So there we are. You probably can finish that one and then we'll meet back for our French knots again. All right, now these French knots might be starting to feel a little redundant, but this is actually the time that you would do all of them. If you held off on doing them, now is your moment. So our French knots, we're gonna come up from the back of the fabric, we're gonna wrap our needle 1, 2 times, and then we're gonna slide our needle into the fabric, pretty much exactly where our thread came up. With our non-dominant hand, we're sliding our knot down to the surface of the fabric. I like to hold it on this kind of angle so that where I've wrapped it holds it tight and then pulling it closed. So the idea is that once you've learned these tips, it makes it just that much easier to get them done, but they are a little finicky and they do take a little bit of like, I've done so many French knots. Sorry, the tail from my French knot came through. I have done so many French knots that it is like muscle memory to me. 1, 2, needle into the fabric, pull your knot down, push your needle a little further, holding the tension but not holding too tight that you can't pull your needle through, and then close. But yeah, like and to be honest, if you will need probably 2 hands. So if you don't have a stand, which most people when they're stitching for the first time don't, there's a few options that you can use. You can lay it between a table and something really heavy to hold the hoop down. So if you lay something heavy on this portion of the hoop and then you can use both hands. Or I used to sit on my sofa with my feet planted on the ground, and then I'd sandwich my hoop between my knees and hold it tight. Pretty much whatever works. Sometimes I would use like this part of my arm and sandwich it between my body. You just got to do what works best for you and figure it out. If you have like a clamp, you could clamp it to a table. There's so many options, and you don't necessarily have to run out and grab a hoop stand. I don't actually use a hoop stand when I'm stitching just casually. I just hold it awkwardly and so that I can use both hands. All right, so our French knots, I think you've seen quite a few demonstrations of those, so you should be ready to get at those and get all of your French knots done. And I will see you soon for our sunflower. All right, so next up on our list is our sunflower. And again, I feel like you guys are going to be absolute pros at this satin stitch flower by the time you're done this kit. So we're doing their 3 strands again, and the same as always, we're going to split the center of our petal. And for this specific flower, I recommend doing what I would call like the foreground flowers. So this one, you can see the ones that you see the full petal, whereas like these ones are meant to be back behind. I'm going to do all of those ones first, and then I'm going to fill in the background ones. It may just be in my own head, but I feel like when I do that, I get a better shape that kind of makes me feel like it's more visible which ones are meant to be behind and which ones are meant to be forward. So we're going to do, I'm going to do one of these little petals for you guys, and then I'll come back and fill in another one of these and then show you the filling in the one behind. So, okay, so this one has a pretty wide base, which was why we were staggering our stitches so much on the other ones and doing so many short to long stitches. So because this one actually has almost as wide of a base as it does at the top, you don't need to really put any short stitches if you don't want to. So this would be more of like a standard satin stitch than it would be like the satin stitch flower concept and when I say satin stitch flower, it doesn't necessarily have to be a flower that you're applying that to. I use flower because I work in 90% florals, but it's pretty much a satin stitch in any shape that isn't like the same on one side as it is. So you're filling like a asymmetrical shape. That's the word I was looking for, asymmetrical. So anytime you're filling an asymmetrical shape, you use kind of that staggered stitches technique. I work in like 99% florals, so I called it my satin stitch flower, but it's not necessarily a specific stitch. So this one was pretty straightforward, this petal specifically, because it was very much even from the top to the bottom. So you can go around and do your front petals, which all will pretty much have the same idea. They might be a little bit, some of them might be a little smaller at the center than other ones, like less symmetrical, right? So you might have to do a few short stitches if you feel it's needed, but I don't think you'll have to do as many, and if you don't do any, that's fine too. I'm just really wanting to shape out the sides of this one. These ones, just because that is how you're gonna help define this front petal to our back petals. So once you've got all of your front petals, so it's pretty much every other petal actually, to be exact. So every other petal, and then they're all pretty close in shape. So I'll only do one, and then we'll come back once I've got my second front petal done, and I'll show you a back petal. Okay, so I've defined my 2 and finished my 2 front ones, and then we're gonna work on the back. And I wanna make sure that it doesn't overlap the front ones, and hopefully you'll still be able to kind of tell that it's a little bit in the background. So what I did for this one is I did a lot of shorter stitches. So just going in and then kind of tipping it in behind the back of that. The only thing that I'll say is I wanted my tip to be a little stronger than that. So I'm gonna go and I'm gonna do one more stitch over top. Just wanna create like where you can see that it's a point. Okay, so we're tucking in behind and more on an angle for these ones than I was doing for the front ones. Probably the most difficult part of this little one is making sure that we get on the outside of that line. I'm even having a little bit of trouble just from the angle I'm at. So I'm putting in more stitches than I would have planned, but I'm trying to make sure that I'm covering that black line. So staying on the outside of that line. And then again, still just scooping it in, tucking it in behind. And they're kind of on a little bit more of an angle than your front ones, which is fine because it helps to keep that shape of looking like it's behind. So I did do more of an angled shape in the back, and then the front were straighter, which helped show that the ones that were more angled were actually behind. And then I'm just going to do a tiny stitch to cover that little spot there. And then, like I've said before, less is more. You want to keep you want to do less than more and then add if you need. So I think you can see what I mean though by the fact that like these ones are straight, so you can see those are the front petals, and then because these ones really angle in along the sides, it helps define which ones are my back petals and which ones are my front petals. We've talked about the satin stitch before. This one is a little bit bigger than any of the satin stitches that we've done. We did our satin stitch up on our white flower. So for this one, I really want to focus on how we can keep our satin stitch straight. So I'm going to start with my first line, and I'm obviously like making a straight line through the center. You can use a ruler if you want to draw some lines. That's totally up to you. Everything will be covered, so you could use a pen if you have one you want to use. Then what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to section off my sunflower. So I'm going to look at it and I'm going to say, okay, this is even to create my next line. Because what will happen if you just do lines side by side is you may end up on like this angle by the time you get to the end of it. And this isn't a massive space, but it is a space big enough that you could really end up on a very different angle than was originally planned. And even now I'm like, is that perfect? It can be difficult. I think that there's like a margin for error. You don't have to like stress yourself out and get out a level to make sure that you're putting it in the exact right spot. But it's nice to define sort of where that one was maybe a little too close to the other one, but that's okay. Though you're going to have put in all of your filler stitches anyways. So if they're too close, that's fine. So we're just going across from one side to the other, kind of just making our outline. And obviously I don't have stitches on both sides, so it's a little harder to show exactly, but you're going to go in or come up pretty much right at the edge of exactly where your stitches come into the center. So, and then you're just filling in those spaces. So for this one, it looks like I'm going to need 2 stitches between this section, and it's much easier. And you can run your needle when they start to get close together, run your needle between the space so that you can make sure you're coming in at the right spot. And then you just basically split each section again. So that one was like 2 stitches for the other one, but this one, like I just threw 1 stitch in the center and it actually filled the whole thing. Whereas I probably, had I stitched directly beside the other one, I probably would have ended up putting 2 stitches in. So it does even save you a little bit of thread because you realize that you sometimes need less stitches than you would have thought. So it makes it easier and you use less thread. Okay, and they sit so much flatter, I find, when you've done it this way because they fill in the gaps perfectly instead of almost like being too full. And then on the edges, which is the same thing, you're just going up and down, I just follow the curve. And then for my very, very tiniest ones on the outside, like if I feel like I just need to shape out that circle a little bit more, I kind of use our technique that we've used. I come up and I go in a little bit like right beside it so that it just kind of curves it out a bit. I don't necessarily make like a very bold end line. I'll almost tuck the ends under a little bit just to help curve it out. I don't know if that's like a technical tip, but it works for me. So when you're coming up, just being careful as you're coming through, because even there I started to kind of come up and I was pulling on one of the threads from my sunflower. So just to be careful that you're not going through the threads that are already there. You want to go next to them. You might snag something. All right, so that should give you enough of a tutorial on how to do your satin stitch. I'm now kind of doing them side by side, but I could have split that. You can either do them side by side, or you can just keep splitting the section until it's full. It's kind of up to you. But I do notice that I've kind of, even by not splitting the section, I kind of moved my angle. I guess it just depends on how good you are at keeping the angle correct. I tend to not have the best perception of level, so I think I'm doing a straight line and then it ends up being totally diagonal. So okay, so we are all finished our satin stitch and it's beautiful. So we're all done on this sunflower and we can move on to our tulip. All right, so it's time for our tulip, which I love this flower so much. Okay, so we really want to define the kind of tip of this one. It gives our tulip the shape we want. So we've got 6 strands, which is because I wanted it to be a little bit of a bulkier flower. I wanted it to have some weight to it. So the first stitch is going to go right down through the center, and I'm kind of coming down on that line. You can see these lines on the outside, and there's a little line on the inside. That is for our other shade. That's going to kind of accent it and give our tulip some depth. So our first stitch is going to go right through the center. And then I really want to have that defined out like tip there. So I want to make sure that my next stitch is sort of below the first one. It'll just help keep the tip a little sharper. Make sure so just giving it, sorry, my knot came through. Okay, and then this one I'm going to tuck just in behind like we've done so many times before, but I want to go pretty much the full length just because this one isn't like, it's not going to be massive, so you don't want to make a super short one because you just won't be able to cover it. So just a little short of the other one. And then keep getting my knot caught, which I absolutely hate. Okay, and then this one I'm going to come down just beside, pretty much actually the same hole as my very first stitch. And I want to keep it, so we don't need a ton of stitches for this one because we are using 6 strands. So I'm going to probably end up at about 4 here. This 4th one, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tuck it in behind. Kind of creates that curve too because it stops a little shorter. It creates the curve of the tulip. Okay, and then over here, I'm going to make sure I'm coming up on the outside of that tip. Actually coming up even a little higher than I did on the other one too. I really want that sharp edge. Okay. And then tucking it in underneath. Trying to keep my stitches quite tight together along the edge here. I'm gonna have to put 1 or probably 2 along this side. So I'm gonna do this one shorter again. Just because like you can see this is sort of like a more of a leaf shape, and with 6 strands, we really don't have a lot of space in the base to be overcrowding that. So, okay. That one created a really nice tip on it, the point of the tulip. So I'm going to come down just behind my center stitch. And then just short, kind of along the line actually, which these outer ones will kind of cover a little bit of. Okay, and then we're going to do our center. Again, I'm really wanting to define that tip, so I'm going to come up, making sure I'm coming up on the outside. I might even come up a little extra, just since we're trying to cover the line and create the tip. I don't want to go too close. Okay, and then down beside. This one I'm gonna try to keep it as much into that full length as I can for the straight satin stitches without obviously interfering in making it too bulky in the center there. This one I'm gonna come down and in. And then for my last one, I'm just gonna really, like for my last one, I'm on this center part, I am just going to tuck it in behind. Oops. On that angle. So again, it creates that kind of curved look, which helps define the 2 petals from each other. I find if you put the outside stitches of a petal on a sharper angle, it really helps to define and create a curved look. Because the natural look of the outside of this petal would kind of have a curve. And then of course defines each petal sort of against each other. Really trying to make sure I'm coming up in the right spot. And then I think, so because I'm gonna have a small stitch right here in the orange, I don't necessarily need to make sure that every stitch makes it all the way down to the bottom, because that orange, or like peachy orange color will sort of cover all of that anyways. Piece of hair. Okay, and then I'm running out of space in here, so I'm just gonna keep my stitches short to fill that spot. And then, like I said, I'm gonna have that little peach part. And then here we go, we're gonna do our little back ones, which I am gonna keep on quite a bit of an angle to, like I said, create the definition. And I'm really wanting to make sure that I keep them at that point so that I'm not getting in it in behind on the angle, and then one more. If you don't feel like you're being as successful with your satin stitch in 6 strands, especially with these little back ones, if you're not finding that you're able to get them to sit quite right, you could drop down to 3 strands for especially, like I still think 6 strands in the front, but if you want for that little back bit, you could drop down to 3 strands. Especially if you're finding you're just having trouble keeping your stitches sort of flat. And I know that as a beginner stitcher, it can be harder to get the right angle and tension. And 3 strands is a little bit more forgiving. So if you are having trouble making it look the way you want it to look, drop down to 3 strands and just fill that in. It'll definitely have a, it'll change the depth on those back petals. You'll really be able to tell that they're the behind petals. Okay. And I'm just tucking it in behind, and then I'm just going to throw maybe one more in here. Finish this curve. Okay, and remembering that I have that orange stitch going right here, so I'm not too worried about that little gap there. And then we are done with the 350 petals, and we can move on to our 38 to 27, I believe. And it will be with 6 strands as well. All right, so we're just gonna do, I'm gonna start with my little orange accent shade right in this middle bit. So I'm just kind of coming down a little bit from the tip. I'm not starting at the very, very top. And I'm just going in right along the edge of where that petal would be. Just throwing in one stitch. And I do want it to kind of tuck behind, so I'm allowing it to kind of almost get lost in there. I don't want it to be gone, but I definitely don't mind if it sits not fully on top. It's kind of just supposed to be like a peak of it. And then the same on this one, just from the bottom, and just a little accent. The bottom ones will be a little bit more pronounced, but it really sort of just defines the shape there. And then we're starting at kind of the bottom of where the petal, it's almost like an extension of, it is an extension of this petal. It's just meant to like be as if the color kind of gradually changed. So I'm going to do the first one all the way down to the bottom, and then I'm going to tuck a few kind of behind the last one, just making them a little shorter. And then my outside ones will become longer again. Or my okay. And then we've probably got one more stitch in us, and it can go all the way down to the base. Everything kind of in the tulip kind of conjugates to this center bit. Sort of creates that right at the stem, right? Just like a flower, it's like that bulb. So we're doing the same thing with our stitches. Okay, and then same thing over here. Just continuing on. This one I have a little bit more room along that spine of it, so I'm going to actually go longer for most of them. I think I have the space for all the stitches, so why not? And then got one more short one. Just want to get really close in there to the last one because I don't want it to be as obvious. It just helps, again, create that more realistic curve. It comes from kind of the right curve there. All right, so I love this tulip so much. I think it's so pretty. Okay, and then I'm kind of just fluffing up just to blend them together and make them look a little bit more seamless. Okay, so we'll move on to our stems for this one, and finally we're done all the stems, and if you haven't done your other stems, this is going to be your time. Okay, so these cute little leaves are probably going to be the hardest leaves on here. Well, obviously, because this one's just a little itty bitty guy, but they are pretty difficult in shape. So we're going to work our way through these, and I'm going to help you. Okay, so we're going to start from the tip, and I'm actually just going to go straight to the top of this line because we really need to have quite a bit of space to create the right angle all the way down. And then I'm going to come up on the side of it, just like a regular leaf stitch. This one's just like a very curvy leaf stitch. So we're coming down and I'm just gonna go just below my last one. And since this is not gonna be a symmetrical like leaf stitch, you don't need to worry about, a lot of the time we match up kind of like we did on our last one. This one won't. You're gonna have a lot more stitches on this side. So just go along your spine and then some of them will match up, some of them won't. And the angles are gonna be very different. It's definitely not gonna. So you're following that line. I'm gonna work on one side and then I'm gonna work on the other. It's just gonna keep me more focused on the shape I'm working on instead of trying to switch angles and switch direction, like switch sections. They're so different that it's not helpful. So the funny thing about this one is because if I keep going down, it doesn't really define this side of the leaf. So I am gonna do sort of what I did with my satin stitch, is I'm gonna tuck some of my leaf stitches behind, especially on this tip part, which isn't something that you would typically do on a leaf stitch, to be honest. I've only ever done it on like a really oddly shaped leaf stitch, but it is because I need to get a bunch of stitches in there on this angle, and covering them just doesn't look quite the same. You ruin the shape of the leaf. So now I have a more clear path to get down to this line so I can start going the full length. So basically, if you have to overlap your other stitches to get to the line, tuck them in behind, and then once you can get there without covering another stitch, you can go straight. So this one I'm gonna actually tuck in behind. And then I'll be getting pretty close to being, and then that prevents you from all of a sudden being like down here, because that's what would probably happen if you were doing a bunch of stitches. Your longest one would be way down here because you do them one after the other, and you don't yet want to have all of the stitches that far down the leaf. We're pretty much on a clear track now, I would say. I might do this one just because they're literally just so close to each other. It'll help me not overload it. You kind of just have to make that, no one's is gonna look exactly the same as another person's, just because your stitches will be different lengths apart. You'll have different, you can try to follow exactly what I'm doing as much as possible. But the amount of tension that you have on your needle, it's always gonna look like slightly different. I know a lot of people don't like that because it's the unknown, but you just gotta follow your own gut and what you've learned and hope that it's enough to do exactly, make it look perfect. And to be honest, like, what's funny about this is I've stitched this pattern now 3 times and none of them look identical. Like, there's so many parts where I'm like, why doesn't that look like that one? I want it to look more like that one. And it just doesn't. It just doesn't. I can't even make them look exactly the same. I think I like this tulip better than the last one. I'm definitely doing a better job of this leaf stitch than the last one I did. So now you're on a nice little angle, probably creating kind of that angular leaf stitch that we know and love. And when you think of an actual leaf and you think of the veins of a leaf, there's always like that one that goes down the middle, and then there's veins on an angle coming in, and that's basically what you're trying to emulate. So we've done the same thing on this side, and we're just following the same vein and filling in all of the leaf. And as we start to get to the bottom, depending on what kind of angle you're on, and if you're not on the exact same angle as me, that's okay. It's not right or wrong, but you want to just kind of finish off on the same angle. If you feel like you need to straighten it out a little bit, if you can, that's an option too. I'm trying to kind of straighten mine a little bit so that I'm on a sharper angle as I'm coming down. And as it gets narrower, it gets a little easier to do that, as you can see. So if you can notice that I'm going on a little bit of a sharper angle, trying to fill the sides here. And then I'm just going to do one little short one to cover this little curve. And then we're all done. So it's definitely like, if you follow that line along, you're going to create the vein of it. And then obviously like your angle here. This side, you don't have to do the same kind of tucking just because it's, and then I just followed all the way down. So you don't actually have, and I am going to actually throw, now that I've, like I always say, less is more. I'm going to throw one more stitch from the bottom here, and I'm going to have it tuck underneath because I just want a nice little line there. Yeah, I think I just needed that extra. So you'll follow the same concept on this side. I'm going to come up at the tip and then come down at the top of that line. And it's the same kind of idea. Like this side, you can see you don't need as many stitches. So I'm just going to create kind of one right here to about there. And then as you can see, like this is all covered underneath of here. I don't need to have more stitches, but when I can start to see that line, that's where my next stitch is going to go. And down onto my vein. And the same thing. So just following where that line shows. And then that same angle. So there isn't a right or wrong angle. There isn't a right or wrong like way for this to look in the end, as long as you like the way it looks. If you don't, you can pull it out and try again. But I highly suggest, if you're working on it and you're like, I don't like the way this is looking, it doesn't look right, or it doesn't look like the example, I like to wait till I'm done the leaf, because sometimes it looks weird in the moment and you're like, how can this end up looking right by the end? But I would say 9 out of 10 times when I'm like, I don't think this is going to work, it actually ends up working by the end. So have some faith. Don't jump the gun and stop too quickly. I mean, unless there's something that you're like, I don't, you kind of, but give yourself a little bit of time to let it try. Because I promise sometimes you will think it's not working and then it totally will. So I'm kind of trying to change my angle a little bit just to get a little bit of a sharper curve here. I want to have a long line there. That didn't work exactly how I wanted it to. There we go. So I kind of fudged that a little bit, but that's like curving my angles. And then the same thing as last time, I'm actually going to do a shorter one here. I don't want to cover because it's such a curve and I can't get to where I need to be without it covering the other stitches. I'm going to do some short ones. And then I think I'm ready to do a long one now. gonna have to do another short one. Maybe a couple even. And then we'll pop a longer one in here now to cover those ends. There we go. That worked out nicely. And then I can go pretty far along and pop in some shorter ones because again, I'm still kind of trying to come over the edge of it. Okay, and then just filling in till it's all done. I ran out of thread, so I'll need to get a little bit more, or I'm almost out of thread. I think I got one last stitch, just my one strand didn't make it in. Anyway, you kind of get the idea. I just, these ones are on, again, a different angle than the middle ones, but as long as you get that really nice vein through the center, you can really create the shape of that leaf. Okay, and then we've just got a split stitch to finish our stem, which I think you've seen quite a few times. I will come back on here and show it to you in just a sec. Okay, so our split stitch, I'm just gonna start at the top. If I can get my needle in. And we're doing the same thing we've done the whole time. It's creating one straight stitch. I'm not really on my line quite right. Coming up a stitch length forward and then going back down through the stitch to split it. And the same thing from here. Splitting my stitch. And probably one last one. You don't need to go, oops. You don't need to go through here. You can just go in as far as you want. I might go, could probably go a little bit further, but I won't go in again and split that last bit. It's just not necessary. You can't really see it anyways. It kind of just blends in and it's just an unnecessary extra stitch. So we're all done our tulip and next is our dahlia. Okay, so this is probably my favorite stitch on this sampler. And it's a lazy daisy, which we're gonna create for first, and then we fill it with our little satin stitches. You are going to need to do these in a very specific order. And I know this can look a little daunting, but we're gonna start and I'm gonna show you how to kind of get a good gauge on which one to do first. So you're gonna start with your outside, and I'm trying to show you why this is important. So you want the back ones to be at the back, and then you want the next row to come over top of it. So it's important because we want to like layer them properly. So the outer layer, you'll see these little dots. That's where you're going to start and stop your lazy daisies. And then obviously this is where you're anchoring them at the top. So I don't want to make you watch too much to learn what we're doing, because the actual stitch isn't necessarily the complicated part. It's the which one to do first, which one to do second. So we're gonna start, you go up, we're using 6 strands. So you're going up from one dot, down through the other dot, holding that little loop, so not closing it, coming up at the tip, and then pulling our little loop closed, and anchoring it. So that part isn't super complicated. We're gonna do all of the ones where you can see the dots around the back here. So I'm gonna show you that again. So you're coming up at the dots. You're holding that thread so that it doesn't close completely. You're not wanting to close your stitch. Just kind of leave it like a loop. And then come up at the tip of where the line with the dots is. And then up through, and then you're just pulling it this closed. And once you get like a nice tight, the tension is all gone, then you're gonna stitch down on the other side of that stitch to close it. So we're gonna go around, we're gonna do all the ones where our little dots are. Some of the dots, like this one specifically, shares a dot with the other one. They're going to be right beside each other. You're creating basically one back row in a circle around of lacy daisies. Okay, so we've got our back row finished, and I think once you finish that row, it's a little easier to see where your next row is. So you can see it really is kind of the tip of the majority of the row that will go after that. But basically look for these tipped ones that are between it and then come down and you'll find the edges. It's all pretty much the top of the, I think, pretty much every single one. So you're just coming and you're doing the exact same thing. You're going to come up at the top there. You're going to go down at the top of, or yeah, the tip of the next one, through the loop, pulling it down. To create like a sharper point, you can pull it even tighter so that it creates a nice sharp tip. And then pulling down. So these ones, you just look for, you'll know you're done when every single one is filled between each one. And you can go back in and do all of those, that second row, and then I'll meet you in for the next row after that. You're on to the next row. You can basically just see any of these ones on the outside are your next row. So just follow the line, wherever the line stops, that's kind of where you're gonna end. Over here, you'll see the dots for each one. So we can go over here to these funny little ones over here that are a little bit on little angles. So we're going to go down at the top and the bottom of the two sides of it. And then coming up, like literally right where those two meet, we're going to come up. And then when you come down, you're basically coming on the other side between those two lazy daisies so that it lays pretty much. I'm just going to give it one more tug. Sorry, I want to make sure that I've got a nice tight tension. And it's coming down pretty much like right on top of those. And then this one's going to cross over a little bit. The base. Coming up right there. Pulling it down. And then going back through. So you should be able to finish the rest of them and find following the lines. It's not, I don't think, you don't need to worry if you're not exactly perfect. This is pretty forgiving, especially because we're going to go over the centers and fill it in, with a satin stitch. Sorry, one more point that I wanted to mention is that as you're getting to this row, leaving them a little bit looser and fluffing them up, because the center of the flower is going to, you want to kind of have a thicker center to create a little bit more of a rounded shape. All right, so we're on to our last row, our middle, which you're going to be pretty much coming up from the same spot or very close quite a few times. So you want to try not to come up at the exact same spot, but they do all converge in the center. So kind of creating a little bit of like a circle in this there, because you're going to also have to have a stitch come through for the satin stitch that we're going to put in there. So I'm coming up, I want to make sure that I'm coming up far enough to make the full petal, and you're creating a lazy daisy. I'm gonna leave mine like pretty loose. I want it to sit on top. I don't want it too tight. Just tight enough that it looks flat, and then anchoring it really gently so that I can create some fluff. Don't want it too tight. And then, yeah, it's gonna be tight in here to get all the stitches in. So if you will have to like kind of tuck it in behind, that's okay. And then you're coming up right in there. You want this one to make sure it's overlapping your other ones. So coming up through, it's okay if it like sits basically on top. That's what you want. I'm not pulling too tight so that it's flat. I want it to sit on top. All right, so this is my favorite part because it's just the part that defines basically the entire flower, and it really starts to come together. So you can start pretty much anywhere. There isn't a right or wrong spot. And you're just gonna do some straight stitches, some satin stitches through the lazy daisies. So I like to try to make them a little, like I don't want to pull too tight. I want it to have a little bit of oomph. So I'm kind of not pulling all the tension out. And you're just basically going inside of the borders of each one. And sometimes, if I'm being honest, it's going to look worse before it looks better. You're going to be like, this doesn't look great. I can't get them all in there. But once you're done, it looks so cute. So just fill it in. Doesn't have to be perfect. I promise you can fluff it up at the end and make them all sit nice. So I just kind of make sure that I've filled each one. It normally takes like a couple stitches per lazy daisy. And you're just going to fill all the way around. And I'm going to move into the center here and show you how we do this middle part of. So I'm coming up from the very center and filling it. And these ones, again, I'm trying to leave these loose to create some texture, right? Like we want that shape. It doesn't matter where, like whether you come up from the center or you come up from the top. Right here, I'm feeling like it might be easier to guide my needle back down through instead of trying to come up through it. We're just filling it in. Adding stitches. Okay, so I'm not going to do all of them for the example. I think that'll just be a little redundant. So once they're all filled in, it's going to look like this. And I know that in the process, like right now, it doesn't look like that yet, but it will. You'll get there. You'll see once you're there. So just keep going and you will get to this look. And yeah, using your needle to kind of fluff them up so that they're sticking out. But sometimes you just have to go through the process to get there, because I promise it looks rougher before it looks better. Okay, so we are at that point where we are ready to finish our hoop and display it. And it kind of, the process here for finishing the back of your hoop is going to really depend on how you want to display it. So the pattern obviously fits into a hoop because I wanted to make sure that if you want to display it in a hoop, you do have the right shape for a circle. But so the first option for backing your hoop is going to be, or the first thing you need to decide when you're backing your hoop is, do you want to leave it as a square? And so part of the reason that I chose this twill fabric is because it has a really nice structure to it. So if you wanted to put this onto something, like into, you know, make yourself a wall hanging of some sort, this is a nice structured fabric. So you can keep it as a square, maybe just trim it up a little bit, and then you could frame this into an actual picture frame or something else. I plan to frame mine, but I have a different framing option. So you can either trim the edges and finish this off and make it into like a tight circle around the edge. That's one of the things that when you are keeping it in the hoop, I always say to trim your edges. Now, because this one is one that I'm not sure, I think a lot of people are going to display it maybe differently. You might not be displaying it in the hoop. You might be displaying it in a frame. I don't want to recommend trimming those edges because I really want you to have the opportunity to frame it however you want or hang it however you want. So if you're planning to put it into like a frame of some sort, I wouldn't trim these edges yet. If you are planning to keep it in the hoop so that it hangs on the wall like this, we would trim our pattern down and taking off so that it's just taking off the corner pieces. And that would be step one. So if you are keeping it in the hoop, we would trim our edges, which I will do right now with this example. Okay. This example is done in it's pre-printed on a different fabric. I normally use this nice cotton fabric for some of our samplers, but for this one, because I wanted something a little bit more weighted, I went with the heavier twill cotton, which I love. And I think it would work. It works really nicely for displaying projects. So I'm just trimming these corner pieces off so that I can do my running stitch around the outside and pull it closed. If you have a separate second piece of fabric, you can layer it. If not, this fabric is heavy enough that you don't need a second layer of fabric. This one is a little bit of a lighter fabric, so I do sometimes like to use a second layer. Before you do your second layer, before you move on to your next step, you're gonna wanna trim up any loose ends. So you're just gonna wanna go around. Make sure that any pieces of thread that are kind of sticking out are all trimmed up so that just in case you can't see them from the front, just getting all of your ends nice and clean. Shouldn't have too many threads that are jumping around from space to space since we did these individually, but if you're yellow, if you didn't tie off in each spot and you've jumped around, you might want to trim up those. Some of our woven wheel threads, and just cleaning it up so that it's all tucked behind in here. If you end up having a thread that you've maybe jumped and you trim it, you can re-thread that needle and just weave it underneath to tuck the thread away. And then the next thing that you'll do is your running stitch. So I'll just do a quick example of how to do the running stitch and what we do. You can use many different methods. Some people glue this fabric inside. I like to use the running stitch just because you just never know if you're gonna wanna get inside of it or if you're gonna wanna take it out of the hoop at some point. And if you've glued it, it's very permanent. So I've tied a knot in the end of my thread and I'm just going to do a running stitch around. So a running stitch is just, you stitch one length forward from the back to the front and then continuing that process all the way around. I normally do about 1/4 inch stitch length. You can do smaller. The smaller you do it, I think the tighter the ruffles end up being, which then makes it lay even flatter at the back. And then you've done your running stitch, your fabric is tight in the hoop, it's all where it needs to be. And then you're just gonna pull your end. I kind of pulled as I went, but you're gonna pull your two ends so that your thread cinches your fabric at the back. And then just a quick tie. I'm gonna use my needle too. You just tie a little knot. It's easy to use your needle. So tying a knot there so that it's nice and tight. And then I just give it a trim. And since I'm keeping it in the hoop for this, it's all ready to go. We've got this nice, so you can hang this on your wall. This can be the way you display yours. It's totally up to you. Everybody has a different preference. One of the things that I love and I've bought before and I only like is these modern Hoopla hoop frames, which are absolutely amazing. And you can put your hoop inside of this hoop frame, which is why I didn't worry too much about this fluff because it fits inside. And then it's inside and it frames your project so beautifully. And I wanted to make sure that there was enough white space around that we could fit this one into one of these hoop frames because I really think this is probably the best way to display these. You can buy these from Modern Hoopla, which is this one is from. There are some on Etsy. You could even, one suggestion that I have, and this one's a bit big, this is for more of a 7-inch hoop or an 8-inch hoop, but I bought this photo frame at the Value Village that I can use for a hoop frame to go inside. I just need to take the hardware off of my hoop to do it, or I could stretch my fabric out and make it fit. You could always do a DIY option like that. But this hoop frame is just absolutely perfect for this design. I feel like it was made for this. And I haven't decided. I bought the neutral color, but I may actually paint that frame. I just haven't decided in what color, whether I want to stain it or whether I want to do it like a pretty color or something. But this is, I think, probably one of my favorite solutions, but you can get creative. You can do tons of things. You can always obviously just hang it on the wall with a little ribbon on the wall, which I think would look so pretty, like a beautiful colored ribbon. Tell me this isn't absolutely adorable. Oh my gosh, how beautiful does that look hanging like that? So lots of people have different options. You can buy colored hoops. This would look so beautiful in a colored hoop that was maybe like a light pink or a purple. Oh my gosh, there's just so many endless options. But yeah, you can kind of figure out what works for you. And I can't wait to see. Please send me pictures. I would love to see it. But that is your tutorial for this flower chart pattern. And I can't wait to see how you did on it. Oh, actually, that's really cute too. So many options. Okay, thank you guys so much for being here and enjoying this kit with me. I hope you love it as much as I did. And yeah, please tag me in any photos that you take of your work.